over the time since I talked to people last, I've been down in the basement of our building. I think last time it felt like I was on a old world map. Now I feel a little bit more like Star Child in 2001. Sort of, that's all right. I hardly go out. A few days ago, some friends came by and took out 4 of the pews that we've had upstairs for 15 years but haven't used. They will reappear at a rather wonderful restaurant shortly. I could hear the pews moving out. I couldn't see them. And it occurred to me I hadn't actually been upstairs into my studio, which is just 8 feet above my head in months. Now, as everything shuts down, it's almost as though the space, which once had been so important, a part of my life, has become a kind of distant, unexplored territory. As the illness progresses and the treatment of the illness progresses, increasing difficulty occurs in the chest, in the mouth, in the transference of material from the mouth to the chest in the form of eating. A few weeks ago, my tongue began to feel as though it was on fire. When the doctor looked in there, he said, "Oh, you have thrush." Thrush is a disease of a kind of, you get when you're a baby, a kind of yeast infection grows on your tongue. And it gets the name, quite honestly, because the speckled appearance of the tongue reminded some ornithologist doctor of a belly of a thrush. Very nice name for a disease. As disease names go. My friend Kathy, who doesn't forget anything, reminded me also that thrush is the name, the acronym of the technological hierarchy for the removal of undesirables and the subjugation of humanity, which was the evil non-government organization that was the opponents of the progressive non-government operation in the Man from U.N.C.L.E., the United Network Command for Law and Enforcement. Thrush had a sort of literary history. In one of the episodes, it was suggested that it was founded in 1907 by a Colonel Moran, who had been the assistant to Dr. Moriarty, the arch enemy of Sherlock Holmes. Colonel Moran, after Moriarty fell to his death in the waterfall, started Thrush in his bid to take over the universe. Funny that those, the Man from U.N.C.L.E. itself was a spin-off of the James Bond films, and there was a kind of interest at the time, even at the height of resistance to the war in Vietnam. Children were still being fed a silly diet of highly militaristic toy advertisements. I remember, for some reason, you go to your local pharmacy and for a couple of bucks, buy all sorts of odd militaristic spy paraphernalia. My favorite was the six-finger gun. It was a pink, of course it was pink, a pink finger that you would hold in your hand, and it could fire explosive bombs or write secret codes or send secret messages via a spring in the finger. And the ad said, I think it was a little doggerel, six finger, man alive. How did you ever get along with five? In order to deal with the mounting levels of pain in my body, I've allowed myself to fall further and further into the chemical solution. What's that? Sorry, every so often I'm getting spotted by Jude about the positioning of my page. Last week I began taking methadone 3 times a day with other pills in order to allow me to eat and bring in calories. I was taken by the notion of going on to medication we associate with kicking a heroin addict, as any other non-heroin addict would be. I will tell you, it's not unpleasant, although it is unpleasant when you miss a dose. You do begin to have unpleasant symptoms. It's also true that you have symptoms in the form of difficulty dreaming. I shouldn't say you, I should say me. Maybe you wouldn't have it. I went into the kitchen the other night and a cockroach crawled out from the wall across my face. And then another cockroach crawled up my leg and then up my shirt and then out across my face. And then I saw another cockroach on the floor and another and another. And I grabbed a broom and started swatting at the cockroaches. And I got tangled up in my air hose and I lost my breath. And I sat down and I swept a bottle of soy sauce off the floor where it shattered and mixed in with the dead cockroaches. Kind of delicious hoisin sauce. In the morning, I told Jude about my adventures in the kitchen, which admittedly sounded like a bad drug-fueled dream. And I said, well, look in the garbage can. We looked in the garbage can, and sure enough, there was a lot of broken glass. So she believed me, although perhaps there were no cockroaches. So quite how complicated the dream was or was not is unclear, but I choose to believe it was real. One dream I know is a dream because it couldn't have been correct. But I suddenly had the insight in the middle of the night that Moses, in addition to thrush being the name of a fungal disease and a bird, that Moses in his swaddling clothes had been found among the thrushes, which sounded like a very elegant confluence of ideas, especially in light of things we'll talk about shortly. Tim, can I hear? I can't hear you, Tim. Can you hear Tim? Now I hear you laughing.
Yeah. I'm taking it easy, you know.
All right, ride the coattails. So of course there is no such as.
You ain't got no coattails.
It's true.
That's a dream.
It's another fever dream.
Oh, yes.
Moses wasn't found in the thrushes, he was found in the rushes. But by the time I realized that, I'd already looked up Moses and thrushes. And in case you're interested, there was a man named Moses Thrush who was born in Indiana in 1927. And his piece of the American history line is that he went to California in 1849, part of the gold rush, made his fortune, went back to Indiana, bought 80 acres of land, lived out his life. The 49ers, of course, were a romantic story narrative of the American expansionism that we look on a little bit differently now when we think of what they did to the environment and the indigenous people at the time. But it took us a long time to figure that out. Every time something goes well for us, the drug works, or I have a better day with my appetite or my breath, Jude sees a positive future, an excellent outcome. I see another turn in an endless cycle. Oh, motherfucker, sorry. In spite of this, hopefully that won't bother us again. This stone we keep pushing up a hill, only to roll back down again. A kind of monotheistic, pantheistic universe of eschatology versus endless revisiting. 8 years ago, when I was first undergoing treatment, I had a sort of notion that was comforting to me at the time that the problems of the world were not my problems. I was somehow exempt from what the healthies were dealing with. At the time, the healthy world was dealing with hurricanes, Sandy, battles in the Middle East. But I gave myself the excuse that those weren't my problems. To some degree, I guess I've hidden behind that idea ever since. Even the stories we were telling last month, about the Sisyphean push towards meaning in a meaningless world, the notion that everything is doomed to some form of failure, that we should keep struggling, and that my battle to regain my breath was both a metaphor and the epitome of some kind of struggle that defined our relationship with life. After the last month of uprisings, responses around the death of Floyd and a number of other of our citizens at the hands of police, Black citizens, even that has shown itself to be a sort of form of privilege. That it's one thing to struggle for breath when that struggle is part of a kind of unexceptional deterioration of the body can be sustained by the best kind of medical care possible. How does that compare to the struggle for breath? Policemen, that's their need to neck or the air life is squeezed from your body. Sure, I mean, we've been talking about this for a long time. I remember a couple of years ago, one of my students said, all art now only be about white. Draconian at the time. I think what I understand is it's not the subject needs to be about white supremacy, but that we're all embedded in the same system that obliges us to recognize the effects of this system of inequality that we've lived in this country ever since, and how that affects everything we do, everything that we think about. I remember a few years ago, one of my doctors at Sloan Kettering told me, I think he was trying to be mindful, that the outcomes for cancer patients at Sloan Kettering were better than they were a few dozen blocks up north at hospitals in Harlem, not because the equipment was better, but because the patients at Sloan Kettering assumed they would get better, because they assumed the system was there to help them. And that notion that they were being served and helped was something that not everyone should assume. It actually had an effect on their survival rates. I remember one of my students saying that even survival of cancer was a reflection of white supremacy. It's never that simple. Oh, nothing is simple. Jude's nephew got caught up in the opioid crisis in Kentucky as a boy. He's now a man. Five years ago, he was arrested for possession of heroin and was put on methadone as a form of a way to escape imprisonment. And every morning he would go to the clinic with his girlfriend, who was also an addict. And they would receive their daily dose of methadone. Methadone is good for addicts because it lasts a long time. You can give somebody a dose in the morning and they're okay till the night. I have to take it 3 times a day because I take so much less than he would. But he would go from the clinic in the morning to his job at the Ford factory in the afternoon, where he would put the engine blocks in the truck. Everything would be okay until he was arrested. As it turns out, you can do methadone and heroin at the same time, which she had been doing. They found him and his girlfriend in the front seat of their car in the parking lot. Their heroin worked. And in the back seat was their daughter. She was old. They were arrested. He ended up on the streets in Utah of all places for poetry. His girlfriend died at the age of 27. Her liver collapsed under the strain of her addictions. She died in the same hospital bed I died in 2 weeks earlier at the age of 94. It's the same hospital bed seemed to be an incredible coincidence until we realized that that's the bed by the exit of the hospital. It's where they put every patient they know is about to die. They can get them out into the first to the morgue without disturbing the other patients. So when you're a 94-year-old man gone through a dozen strokes, which was a 27-year-old heroin addict, you've noticed that the hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, all the patients were white, all the orderlies were black. In this room where I'm living, I'm floor by synagogue. When we decided we would convert our building from religious establishment to a home, we looked into getting our taxes changed. There were no taxes on a church, but there are very high taxes on anything except residence. And we wanted to figure out if we could live in a residence. So a man came and he took out a tape measure and he began measuring the distance from the floor to the ceiling, from the middle of our window to the ceiling. He went outside and he measured the height of the curb relative to the window. We asked him why, and he said, it went back to the days of immigration, overpopulation on the Lower East Side of New York City, and half of the population, to more than half, couldn't speak English as a first language. People were living underground like moles, and this was a great reformation. First in 1866, that the curb had to be at least a foot from the ceiling of the roof of the lowest room in a building. And then in 1920s, around the time of our last pandemic, at the middle of the window of the bottommost floor had to be at least halfway close. The middle of the window had to be at the height of the curb. If it was below, you lived in a cellar and it was illegal. If it was above, you lived in a basement and that was legal. Completely sort of arbitrary notation, but the only reform that they could pass that assured there would be some reasonable amount of light and air going into these spaces, which were otherwise breeding ground for pestilence and disease and death. Even this reform was met with great resistance. There were a lot of people who felt like people coming into the cities of the north, Eastern Europe, Central Europe, Asia, south of our own country didn't deserve to be there, certainly didn't deserve the protection of the state. In fact, so a few years later, the Immigration Act of 1924 put severe quotas on the number of people who come in from Eastern and Southern Europe, Slovaks, Poles, Jews. They eliminated everybody coming from Japan. 40 years later, the Anti-Chinese Immigration Act eliminated Chinese workers from coming at all. This was all to preserve the great white race, which felt itself to be under attack. Under attack at this point for the most rational of reasons. These people did not consider themselves bigots, but scientists. They built their notions on Darwinian theory and statistics, the science of statistics. Its original literal meaning was political arithmetic, which sounds a little bit more odd. The progressive notion that spawned all sorts of good works in terms of environmental conservation, but also some social reforms, was that in the natural world, if you were weak, you were cut from the herd. And you would not perpetuate your seed. And the species would grow stronger. The Industrial Revolution meant that people were surviving who should not survive. It meant that there was overpopulation of predators in the wild that would extinguish vulnerable populations. And there was an overpopulation of species in the human race that would threaten the vulnerabilities of the great vulnerable races of superior people, i.e. white people. A pantheon of these characters, Madison Grant, who wrote The Passing of the White Race, that was admired by Hitler, also putting beings on display in museums. Bruce Haeckel, a scientist who popularized Darwinian theory and led directly or indirectly to more of Hitler's innovations. Even especially politicians like Teddy Roosevelt, who took these ideas and ran with them. They were all recognized and even lauded in their times they got their names and faces on monuments and sides of mountains. The animals were named after them. There's a Grant's caribou. There are lions named after Teddy Roosevelt, and birds as well. Also teddy bears. Sorry, my dog is attacking me. Teddy is especially topical these days. His great claim to fame has sprung him from relative obscurity as the Undersecretary of the Navy, I believe, to vice presidential candidate, and ultimately the presidency, was discharged at San Juan Hill during the Spanish-American War in Cuba. Beginning of our entry into the world of colonial empire. He was very much in favor of this war. He saw an opportunity there. He convinced the superiors to allow him to mount his own sort of personal cavalry in the war, which he branded the Rough Rider. He had a genius for publicity and self-promotion. And he thought to himself, who are the best riders in the world for cavalry? Obviously, it was cowboys and Indians. He hired a bunch of cowboys and Indians to ride his horses. And then he said, who embodies the greatest confluence of strength and brains? And it was football players from the Ivy League. So the Ivy League adventurer athletes, cowboys and Indians. He led them up San Juan Hill, but they were instantly in great trouble. They were only rescued by a contingent of regular soldiers from the segregated army, black soldiers, known as the Buffalo soldiers, go down, help them get up the hill, and conquer the defending Spanish forces. There was a brief moment of true euphoria when the cowboys and the Indians and the football players and the black soldiers and the regular army celebrated together. And Teddy said they'd done a fine job. But when he went home to write his story and become the national figure he wished to be, you can see him gradually changing the narrative. First they fought, the black soldiers fought well. Then they fought no better or worse than any other soldier. Then they fought acceptably, but only when they were under the leadership of white officers. And then finally he claimed that he had his son on his soldiers, the black soldiers. He had no command over them whatsoever, and urged them and forced them up the mountain because of the cowards. Because he sensed it would not be acceptable that the national war hero would command or benefit from the actions of those soldiers. When I do go outside, these days, the time has passed, especially that sometimes, the last time I went out, I realized it had been winter before, and suddenly the trees were filled with leaves. There were cats walking on the street. There was a squirrel running up and down the tree. Birds flying down from the eaves above. There was one little brown bird. It didn't seem particularly interesting, but I didn't know the name. I sent a picture of it to my mother. Didn't know the name, so she said she would ask her friends in the bird watching community to try to identify the bird. It seemed like a useful, harmful preoccupation. Farther down the block than the fire hydrant these days. I don't think of it as my own San Juan Hill, but I can get there and back, and then I have to rest. I have to admit that most of what I do is stare at screens, try to take some pleasure from what I see there. I've started watching lots of films that show you how to do things well. I don't know why. It gives me the ASMR, the sensory feedback. Physically pleasurable ASMR. I'm watching people turning giant frozen tuna into little pieces of sushi with a few deft cuts here and there. Then I started watching people creating tubas. They turning metal. Those are also very beautiful to watch. Then I started to fall into the rabbit hole. Videos of the world's worst airplanes, which are also fun to look at. The PG Racer, Howard Hughes flew. A small engine, a little place for the person in the back. You guys watch them race around the pylons in the 1930s because they crashed many times. I like to watch crashes. Remind me of all the drawings I used to make of airplanes as a child. They were always filled with guns, firing off in various directions, and bombs. I never actually had an enemy in the picture. I just liked drawing all these bombs and guns. Follow the video trail. It's hard to not do that when you start with one video to end on another video some other place. For men, doing the same thing I did as a child, building model airplanes, except now it's not a hobby for 10-year-olds with $2 to spare. They seem to be spending hundreds of dollars building these incredibly detailed miniatures where they try to get seatbelt down to the last buckle, even at a scale that's so minuscule that you can't possibly see this with the naked eye. It just satisfies some need they have to create these sort of perfect little worlds. The theory about the miniature, of course, is that it's a utopia that you cannot enter of a kind of perfected space. It makes you think about the fact that these planes fought in wars where thousands, millions of people were burned and incinerated. But the details and the romance of the planes themselves are all that's left behind. And somehow the notion that the implements of the war bore no moral responsibility for the war, therefore we should take pleasure in their presence in these altered states without dwelling on the history of man. Briefly tell you about the movie that shows up after you look at a model airplane movie, which is how-to videos from the 1940s for pilots and soldiers how to operate their plane, how to feel good about themselves. There's one particular called The Rear Gunner, starring young Burgess Meredith, before he was the Penguin or Rocky Balboa's trainer. He's a pipsqueak who has no job except to hang around this big B-24 bomber, mooning at the guns until the handsome and dynamic pilot, like Ronald Reagan, sends him to flight school, gunnery school to become a gunner. And on one great day, he's shooting down Japanese planes from the rear of the gunship, and how they're forced to land on a tiny little island. How Ronald Reagan does it, I don't know. They all jump out of the plane, hide behind the palm tree. The Japanese plane keeps strafing them, flying over until finally bird just can't take it anymore. He hops in the back of the plane and shoots it down from a sitting position. And then is awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, at which point the general turns to the camera and says something to the effect that in this war, every one of us, even the smallest and least consequential, has a role to play. And the music swells, and we all feel good about ourselves. The other form of passivity that is created by staying in your house, the universe, to send you a signal about what to do next. And nothing is more random to me than books that comes in the mail unsolicited. Living in Los Angeles, we get lots of unsolicited books. The most recent was called Change. It's the story of a man, not uncommon, the nurture that comes to synagogue, a Jew who discovered Jesus. And he's striving to convince you that if you would accept Jesus yourself, you will be in a lot better shape. The story, I'm trying to do this as a converted story, that he experienced some sort of sexual experience which defiles him. It defiles him to the point that he could not cleanse himself. And he rinsed, he would take showers for hours and hours on end, and still would not be cured. So he engaged in a search. He felt like if the words of Jesus, A, could address the issue of defilement, and if Jesus, B, could be held to be relevant to a Jew, then he would be saved. So he found the solution, A, in the words of Jesus, and the defilement comes from the mouth, from inside instead of outside. And he found a reason to follow Jesus in the anecdote that Jesus saw himself as a paschal lamb of the Jews, in other words, sacrifice for the good of his community. Praying he had a solution. Jesus to save him from defilement. This is him defiled. Jesus. You see that, Jude? I'm not spending too much time on that. The question, of course, that you have if you're not automatically convinced is what came first? The egg of enlightenment or the chicken of evidence? Faith or trust? If it's true that he really didn't know what to do, he's stuck in a bit of a conundrum. Has to make a leap of faith at some point. In that sense, he doesn't have the same problem, although it sounds similar. The solution is not the wager of Pascal. And Pascal, the mathematician, said, we are all born subject to a bet. God either exists or does not exist. But if you solve the process rationally, the application of revolutionary notions of probability theory, you'll have to believe because the outcome, if you believe in God, God exists, you're rewarded with an infinity of good in the form of heaven. If you wager that God does not exist, and you're wrong, you lose all infinity in hell. Much better than to think God exists and God does not exist, but just being wrong. There's some problems with this that we can go into later. But in that sense, it's a little bit off the solution that my friend, the book writer, brings out of a sort of American pragmatism as embodied by the thinking of William James philosopher and humanist psychologist, who also believed, he believed that his faith in God had saved him from a crippling depression as a young man. And he set about trying to prove that it was rational to believe in God, even without evidence. We call this the will to believe. It's not quite the same bet that Pascal made, but the notion is it's acceptable to believe in something without evidence, such as God, if the outcome can only be achieved by the belief in God, or belief in whatever it is, and that the outcome is important. So he might not have been able to believe in God when he was young and depressed, but because he did, he survived his depression, and therefore it was acceptable to believe in God. James was notoriously neurotic and unable to make up his mind about anything but the philosophy he and some of his contemporaries came up with. Pragmatism allowed them, to some degree, to adopt a very relativistic notion of truth, insofar as truth is the best answer we can come up with now. It's the absolute truth, but it's somewhat subject to change based on new evidence, which we can accept. The famous story about him, illustrating this point, is squirrels and trees in it too. Suppose you want to see the squirrel on the other side of a tree. You run around the tree to see the squirrel, but the squirrel doesn't want you to see it, so it runs around to the other side of the tree. And no matter how many times you, William James, circle the tree, the squirrel circles in the other direction, keeping the tree between you and it. So the question is, are you going around the squirrel or not? The answer is yes to both. You're going around the squirrel if you define your relationship to the squirrel based on your position relative to the tree on which the squirrel resides, north, south. You're north, south, east, and west of the tree at any point, and the squirrel remains on the tree, therefore you've circled it. But if you're interested in your relationship with the squirrel itself, then you're always facing the squirrel and you never go around it. But either answer is acceptable. And so you can go ahead with your life without the awful burden of having had to make a choice. Tonight. James was going to college at the same time that the Civil War was blowing up in the faces of Americans, North and South, who wished to avoid or engage in the war. Like many intellectuals and progressives, James and his friends were against the war, but were unrepentant white supremacists on the level that we did not accept. They didn't see the enslaved people as their equals, but merely the subjects of a kind of moral imperative that they in their enlightened condition had to obey. Even though James felt that way, he could never quite bring himself to enlist. He spent half the war worrying about enlisting, and then after the war regretting that he hadn't enlisted. His friend Oliver Wendell Holmes, more of a man of action, did enlist, not because he was particularly convinced of the cause, but he was a patriot of the North. He saw terrible action. He was shot, left for dead several times, shot in the throat, shot in the chest, shot in the foot. Prayed that they would cut off his foot so we wouldn't have to go back to the war. But he did survive the war. He went on to lead a very long, distinguished life. He's one of those human wormholes in American history. As a boy, he stood in the hands of John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States. And as an old man, he stood in the hand of John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th president of the United States. His grandmother told him stories about the occupation of Boston by the Redcoats during the Revolutionary War. He became a judge on the Supreme Court. One of his last law clerks was Alger Hish, was caught up in the Red Scares of the 50s. Didn't die until 1990. A span of people in history of over 200 years embodied in one human being's life. Holmes's conclusion after having gone to war is that basically nothing you believed in so passionately that you were willing to die or kill for it could possibly be right, because he saw the consequence of that kind of assuredness and that it was horrifying. So even though he was no progressive himself, he always seemed to vote in favor of individuals seeking to change the status quo of the United States laws and orders, not because he thought they were right, he was convinced they were mostly wrong, but he felt that if we didn't allow for this attempts to change the system, not only would we miss out on the possibility of an improvement, which doubted existed, but that sooner or later, the world would blow up again and we'd all be at each other's throats. As a distant academic grand stepchild of William James, I studied anthropology and psychology in college. Unlike Pascal, I lost my faith in anthropology class when I read about a village in Africa that was centered on a tree that was as old as the universe itself. When that tree died, I assumed the universe would die. The notion of a cosmology that was so intimate and personal that the center of the universe was right there outside of your front door was so incredible to me, it made me give up on whatever religion of my own I had, because there was obviously too many systems to account for of equal credibility for any one of them to be right. Pascal's answer to this, of course, is that even though he said he was rationally basing his wager on the existence of God, on the notion of God itself as an abstraction, what he really meant was a Protestant Christian God, usually heaven and hell. And if you suggested any other God, from the Catholics to the Jews to the Islamists to all of the pantheistic religions, you weren't really being serious, and you weren't deserving of his serious consideration. All these studies took place inside an enormous edifice, 16-story building named after William James Hall, where the anthropology and psychology programs were housed. I was drawn to forms of psychology and anthropology that emphasized the pictorial, perhaps not surprisingly. Particularly something called the thematic apperception test, based on the subjective interpretation of visual data and fantasy in some sort of measurable, systematic way. This is how it would work. You'd be shown a picture, a drawing, a photo of some suggestive, ambiguous image, say two men boxing, and then be asked to create a story. The story would then be rated on its levels of need for affiliation, power, or achievement. If you said, this guy's gonna knock this guy's block off, and he'd have a bloody nose, and he'd be smashed, and break all his bones, and you have a need for power, which means you probably just want people to pay attention to you, and you want them to inflict your authority over others. You don't really care about the aftermath. You just want that experience of control. If you say, this guy has the box and makes some money because his grandmother has an eye disease, and unless he can get the money for the operation, she's going to go blind, and he doesn't realize the box, but he really loves his grandmother. And you have a need for affiliation. It means that relationships are important to you. Consequences aren't so much, but you want a system that emphasizes all kinds of permanent and sort of immutable personal, political, economic relationships. If you say, no, he's been practicing since he was a little boy, he's the best boxer he possibly can be, and he's the best boxer he can possibly be, he has all the technique, and he's strong, and he's trained, and he's about to win the world championship of the world, I guess that's what that means, and all his hopes and dreams that he's worked so hard to achieve are about to come true. If you have a need for achievement, you know how to plan, you know how to calculate, you know whether you want to do these things. And the notion is, if you can do all this, you'll do very well in this world in which the psychologists operated. And that American entrepreneurs, in fact, the entire American economic system, which when this was developed and ascended in the world, was based on having people with a need for achievement dominate. I believe this to the point of sort of religion. If we go to small villages in India, hierarchical caste systems where everybody should, I had an affiliation need and never got anything done that they were told to do by somebody in charge. And give them the tasks and then train them on how to fantasize more about power. I mean, on achievement, excuse me. And then immediately they said very proudly, these people all started micro businesses like bike repair shops and began to make more money. The inventor of this system was a character named Henry Murray, who was Harvard jock himself. He was a bit of an eccentric. His mentor was young and he gave him a lot of his ideas about LSD percussion. His muse, as he called it, was a talented, extraordinary woman named Christina Morgan, who he was in love with, but was afraid to leave his wife for. So he asked Young to tell him what to do, and Young had. She came to visit Young, and Young decided that she was the epitome of some sort of animal, the ideal woman, which to him meant that she was the ideal muse to a powerful man such as himself. For Henry, and he advised them to have an affair to unleash their creative and erotic energies. She told Christina that she had an opportunity to do something, greatest thing a woman could do, which is to give birth to a man, not a baby, but a man like Morgan, like Murray. Murray reciprocated by having cast on the Shaft Street one of his Uber women sculptures of Christina. I don't know if that's just the word. They used Christina's drawings that Young was obsessed with as the basis of the early thematic apperception test. In fact, she was colossal, even though she had no degrees on his early publishing attempts. But she was gradually written out of history until she disappeared. She eventually died under mysterious circumstances in the Virgin Islands, probably a suicide. Morgan's real love, I suspect, was Herman Melville. He was obsessed, as were many, with the author of the Great White Whale, Moby Dick. He was the president of the Melville Society. And really, the origins of the thematic apperception test came from the chapter on the doubloon, the rolling doubloon in Moby Dick. They have the obsessed captain nails a golden coin to the mast and says the first person to find the white whale will win this coin. And to pass the time, they study the coin. It's a real coin. It was minted in Quito, Ecuador, on the farm mountaintops of the Alps. On top of each mountain is respectively a tower of fire and a crowing rooster. Across the top is the zodiac, the sun in transit. When Ahab examines the coin, he says, this is obviously an image of myself. I am watchful, I am powerful, I am on fire. Starbuck, the religious first mate, sees this as the Holy Trinity. Other sailors see a dirty story, or simply the amount of cigars you could buy with the coin. Cowboy sees the fate of the ship itself in the nail through the coin. But Moby Dick will nail them to the bottom of the ocean as surely as this coin is nailed to the mast. And they will all go to judgment and be forgotten. The thematic apperception test was applied in a famous study to the indigenous people in Nigeria, the Igbo, the Hausa, the Yoruba. When I was in college, my advisor was a woman from Nigeria, member of the Igbo tribe, and she was offended by this study because the study showed that you give these different tribes the test. The Yoruba and the Hausa were the dominant populations, had long histories of trading with the West, with the Europeans, and were a aristocratic hierarchical society. They scored high on needs affiliation. They existed well in a system of patronage, whereas the ethnic minority of the Igbo scored extraordinarily high on need for achievement. They lived in small societies. They were highly incentivized. They did extraordinarily well in the British colonial protectorate system. They were, in conclusion of the test giver, all small American style entrepreneurs. Eleanor, my advisor, realized this was a gross mischaracterization or caricature of the Igbo culture. Far from being these sort of linear self-achievers, overt personally driven achievers, that this test seemed to indicate they were embedded in a culture that the test givers should not begin to understand, that revolved around a sense of community and identity and spirit we see as chi, G-H-I, which is both your individual and your collective identity. And that the work that you did to maximize your own success is also a form of spiritual and deep identification. That you're operating on your own, you're operating within a deeply social, spiritual context. We used as our text beyond the critique of the paper, the novel by Achebe, Things Fall Apart, which sort of illustrates the story of one man's conflict with the colonial system. He's driven by demons to right the wrongs done by his father, but every time he comes up with a solution which seems impractical, beaten down by the system until he's finally killed. This is all operating within the context of the Biafran War, which had ended just a few years before. Up to 3 million people were slaughtered. The Igbo were trying to carve out a homeland within the larger Nigerian landmass and were brutally put down. But Things Fall Apart is a line from the poem by Yeats. About the end of times, and there's a complete destruction, abandonment of social mores. The center cannot hold the falcon. You no longer hear the falconer. He was writing it at a point when the World War I just ended. The Irish uprising was beginning. He was involved. And the pandemic of 1919 was in full blast. His wife was pregnant, was dying. You can imagine why he wrote this poem. His wife survived, however, she was extraordinarily tough woman. The widening gyres that he spoke of, we see as apocalyptic, and they seem apocalyptic. In fact, every time there's a mass disaster, who will search for the poem goes up. After Trump's election in 2016, searches for the poem hit a 30-year high. But Yeats may not have meant it quite that way. Georgia Lees, his wife, maintained his interest, notoriously wandering Yeats, was also a sort of spiritualist going on magic. She used a form of automatic writing to communicate with the afterworld in a way that he used to produce the metaphors for the poem. And that image of the gyre is not simply incidental to him. He actually had a vast and complicated crackpot theology, cosmology based on gyres, that the whole universe was built of these spirals of increasing and decreasing coherence, primarily in ancestral gyres that produced the eras of greater and lesser stability and integration. That every 26,000 years we went through a complete cycle. So that was one cosmic year, and then divided into that was like 1,000-year months, and every 1,000 years we would reach a peak and then a nadir. So you can sort of see the 500 BC would be the world age of Greece, and 1,000 years later Byzantium, 1,000 years later the Renaissance. We have a few hundred years to go before our next good times. In the meantime, we're stuck in a bad cycle. War in Nigeria, the Biafran War was fought with those same weapons from World War II that we were just looking at in the 25s and 26s, dropping their ancient bombs on each other, flown by wild adventurers from Europe and various parts of the country. When I was watching those images, another film arises called Welcome to Britain. It also stars Burgess Meredith as an everyman. It was shown to GIs in Britain, show them how to get along in the world. Britain during the war was impoverished, so the inhabitants didn't have enough food or money, so you shouldn't go into a bar or a pub and throw your money around. You shouldn't eat more than your share of food if they invite you to dinner. There's one scene where Burgess is getting off a train in London, and he gets out of his car, and then a black soldier gets out, an American black soldier gets out. And a moment later, an old lady pops her head out of the window and says, "It was so nice to meet you boys." She joins the black soldier and says, "Isn't it funny that we both come from Birmingham? Next time you're in town, you must drop by for tea." And then she turns to Burgess and says, "You should come by too." And then the other soldier says, "I gotta get some cigarettes," and he walks off. And then Burgess turns to the camera and very seriously addresses his audience. The audience is white soldiers. You can see, because he says, "What you just saw is very normal in this country. A white woman inviting a colored soldier over for tea. Nothing, he was polite, he was polite. This is very normal. And we must understand that this will not happen in our country. We're not in our country. We're another country. We cannot impose our feelings on them." And he doesn't, unclear whether he's saying they're more sophisticated or less sophisticated than us. I believe he's saying we cannot bring our prejudices with us. They have to, in order to serve the greater good, we have to accept that they have values that we cannot accept. But then he notices a general off to the side talking to his assistants. And he says, "There's General Lee. His ancestors fought in the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy." This is to give his position credibility. And he says, "Let's ask him what he thinks." So the two of them, he's joined by the other soldier now, go over and talk to General Lee, who's actually a real person, General John Clifford Hodges Lee, known as Jesus Christ himself. He was a sort of ordinary religious man, but a progressive by the standards of the day. And Burgess asked him what he thinks of having the two of them serve together. And General Lee says, well, you're both here together doing the same job because it doesn't matter what color you are when you're dead. Doesn't seem all that hopeful. But he says, basically, we must work as best we can for now, but be patient. How he's talking, I don't know if he's talking to both of them or one of them. Be patient, because obviously change will not come quickly, but for now, we have to fight the war that's in front of us. Then he walks away, and Bridges Meredith, another soldier who's never named, share a cigarette, or rather they share a match to light their own cigarettes. And as they light the cigarettes, the music swells to an almost unbearable level of pathos and triumph. Back in the house, metaphor I used before of the universe defined by Swiss Army was a limit. Now I think of it as an island with rising seas, shortened and cut off, increasingly dire effects from the rest of the world. I wonder how soon it is before I'm underwater. In the meantime, though, everybody marches in our neighborhood, but every night there are fireworks go on from about midnight to 4 a.m. So loud that can't sleep. Every Friday night in the afternoon, trucks pull up on the corner and food is given out. In the afternoon, there's a long line. By the end of the afternoon, there are very few people there. And they try to give food away to anyone who will take it. We try not to be around at the moment, but our neighbors all line up for food. If they see us, they insist that we go there and take the food. Their position is, this is food that's owed, that is coming from the government, and the government, whatever the government will give them, even if they don't need it, is not only theirs by right, but everyone's by right. And we're forced into this sort of awkward white middle class problem of not wanting to insult the people, the friends in front of us who want us to participate in this interaction with the government that seems so simple and straightforward to them, so complicated to us. We don't want to take the food if we don't want it. We're going to tell our friends. Not entirely sure what it means not to have to take the food and to food in any case. So we set ourselves with the classic compromise of taking the food and then donating to a food drive pantry. I don't know what's going to happen when I get out of this hole. Like, I would like to get out of the hole. I would like to see this brave new world that we all hope that we're working for. In a way, I feel a little bit like a reverse Moses. I never led anybody anywhere, never did anything of consequence. It would be nice to see that promised land. Sure. But then I had to go and look up reverse Moses in the Urban Dictionary. And it turns out it's a somewhat obscure, to me at least, sex term. But there's also a term, triple reverse osmosis, which is an act of achievement in the diving or ski world, an athletic slip or jump that's so incredible that it defies predictions of the scientists. No human should be able to complete 3,000-degree triple lux spin, but somebody did. So they have completed a reverse osmosis. Another book came in the mail recently, I should say. It was a book of birds by my mother. My mother had found birds in New York. I immediately looked up thrush, of course. There it was, a little speckled bird, not unlike the bird that I'd seen. There's not really sufficient evidence to show that the bird photoresolve a thrush would be so much nicer than it was, both the infection on my tongue and the bird outside the house, as well as the acronym of the world dominating evil corporation. In any case, the will to believe I bring that argues that even without sufficient evidence, I can believe that. When we first moved to this neighborhood, our neighbors used to have their weekly community meetings in our sanctuary. And the story I've told before means I see very differently now than in past years. Somebody brought up the notion that the trees in our neighborhood are very old, which is something we noticed. We have very beautiful trees, so old that they grow and form a canopy over the street. In the summer, when they leaf out, there's a wonderful shade, wonderful breeze that's created by the leaves. One of the nicest things about the neighborhood, we thought, were these old trees. But that wasn't why this was brought up by our neighbor at the meeting. They said, if you go to nicer neighborhoods, you'll see they have new trees. Nice neighborhoods have new trees. We should ask the city to come take out our old trees and put in new trees. Whatever the trees themselves represented, to us, to them, it was a kind of disrespect and negligence. Even the beauty of the trees, we saw them, could also be seen through a different lens as the manifestation of the system that paid them no attention. It'd be better to have a small, weak, lame, new tree than an old, stately, neglectful tree. Thanks. Thanks, Tim. You're all free to go. Anybody who wants to stay on, David will unmute us for as long or as short time as anybody wants to say hi. I see a lot of people have gotten. Yeah.
I'm not gonna unmute you. All I hear was your sound.
Themselves now.
Dude. Sorry about I seem to have gotten dirt everywhere. Well, if anybody wants a drawing, come up front. I've got plenty here.
I'll take one.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. You're free to go.
I think people are having trouble unmuting.
Oh, really?
That's what it said. Your mom just said that. Oh, David needs to unmute.
David, you have to unmute everybody from Central Command headquarters.
Okay.
It,
I hear you. I don't think I heard you, David.
yeah, I'm back.
Shit. What time did we start? Shit. Sorry about that, everybody.
We're trying. I'll be right back.
Mm. David, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
People, I'm seeing comments from a couple of people that they're still muted. That's all right.
Well, they should go down to their little mute button in the bottom left corner and unmute themselves.
I think
Because
they're
I'm doing
doing
it one at a time here.
They're saying that you've taken the unmute off your control, right?
Only Jesus Christ. All right. Very nice, gentlemen.
Was that you, Paul? Did I hear you?
Yep, so finally the host allowed me back in. Well, that was
Oh. Man, Tom.
Hi, Matt.
Hey, hey. Huh. Louisa, are you muted because you want to be muted? I'm just. Well, I see. Hey, Kristen.
Hey, Matt.
All right.
Yeah, Baloo. Baloo, your hair.
Hey, Matt.
Oh, hey.
We're muted. Hi, Matt.
Hey.
Unmuted.
Oh, man.
Got it. There. I'm in. Hi, Matt. Hi, Tim. Everyone.
Tim. Hi, Matt. Hi, Tim. Hi, Matt.
Hi. How are you?
Hey, guys.
Good.
Thanks for the performance.
Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's great to be able to be in Brooklyn from from way a ways.
I'm coming up front for a drawing. I want one with the bird in it.
Oh, I took a picture with my phone of the one with the bird in it.
Got a lot of
But you can
birds.
have it. Matt, I have a question.
Yay.
How much do you think about the drawings in advance in relation to the dialogue? Is it more improvised?
Well, that's interesting. I do a ton of preliminary drawings over and over again up until the last minute. They're like this. They're like little, you know,
Matt,
storyline.
these are some of the best drawings.
Yeah, excellent.
These are some of my favorites.
Yeah, but I think a lot changes when I use it, because this is such a messy process. I usually save the messiest but most interesting lines for the performance. It's also, I mean, I do some practice at scale, but I sort of know what I want to do, but the drawings, once you start them, sort of take on a life of their own, so I don't really know what's going to happen. And
Well, I'm
sometimes-
here with a bunch of Berkeley musicians,
yeah.
and they were watching for a while, and basically they're saying, he's doing jazz. What he's doing is jazz. I thought that was a really great analogy.
It's funny. I mean, years and years ago, I was doing a story about the cartoonist Art Spiegelman for an arts magazine, and I went with him to a number of other cartoonists like to do this thing where they would work together on a single stone etching. So they would each make a drawing and then they'd respond to it. And they called that jamming. They thought of it as a form of improvised, interactive drawing.
Mr. Sheriff, all right.
Yes.
All right. Beautiful. Beautiful.
David Harris literally epitomizes that.
That's what we needed. That's what we needed.
You know, I would have gone to college if I knew there was someone like you there.
David, do you think of drawing as jazz? Improvise your drawing?
It's, if you have to ask, it's not jazz.
There you go.
Right. It's all jazz. It's all not jazz. You know, interestingly, I was on the phone for an hour with William James's great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Sam Mason, today.
Really?
Yeah.
How is that? How is that a thing?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting.
Is he a musician or a psychologist?
He plays music. He does, he's actually like a video animation wizard.
Wow.
But a really, really close friend of mine. His mother's name is Jemima James.
I was ragging on William James a little bit just for the storyline.
Mhm.
He was a very interesting character.
Yeah.
Have you ever read the Metaphysical Club Society? It's really interesting. The story of James and Holmes and Charles Peirce in the sort of intellectual and moral history of the United States in the 19th century. But you'd like it. It's really, you know, it's sort of jumping around from character, but James. It's really about James, Holmes, Peirce, and John Dewey, the philosopher.
Yeah. Yeah, my the artist I studied was C. Armajan. He was very much into Peirce and Dewey.
Really?
So I was indoctrinated sort of at a young age into the American pragmatists. And
Just
anyhow,
more heavy on the pragmatists at first, and then
yeah.
I was persuaded by my cohorts that maybe maybe that wasn't the juiciest subject.
Who knows?
Yeah.
William James always pissed me off. No, because he tried to explain the existence of God. I mean, he tried to come up with a rational argument for it, right? Isn't that what he did?
Right, that's what I was talking about. Right, his will to believe.
Yeah, that was like the stupidest idea I could imagine.
Well, he tried.
Try. Everybody's
He
trying.
tried to explain the rationale for believing in God.
Oh,
Right.
is that what it was?
Yes.
I thought it was for the existence of God.
Well, the
Well,
idea was,
you said you have to make a choice. You can't not do either. And if this is what you're giving up if you don't.
that's also what Pascal. That's my brother Josh, and all this is somewhat predicated on this. The unspoken theory behind this is I think Josh operates from this pragmatic point of view, and we make a lot of our decisions about health care based on James's notion that whatever choice you make now based on the evidence in front of you is the best choice you can make now based on the evidence in front of you. And whether it turns out to be right or wrong, you have to live with it and not regret that choice when other later evidence might indicate you could have made a better choice. Because that information wasn't available to you. And that's kind of comforting when you're sick and you have a disease that can't really be cured. You just have to sort of move at this incremental pace from choice to choice.
Yeah, that's a mature scientist. If your experiment doesn't work, you move on and try something again.
Unfortunately, the position of the scientist and the patient is somewhat different. The scientist has an infinite number of experiments and theories, but the patient only has a couple of shots.
Right.
But,
Yeah, it's kind of like this country right now. They say, don't wear masks, and that doesn't work. So they say, wear masks.
right. That was not a right point.
Well, you split the difference. You put it on your chin. That's what we do in Ridgewood. It's a theoretical mask.
Right. It's a right. It's if you're mask adjacent, that could use some.
Yeah.
Well, you said that from the beginning, Josh. As soon as they started saying masks only help you, they only help doctors. They don't help anybody else. Like, why could that possibly be true?
Can you see this?
Yeah, their goal was somewhat what?
The end is near, so wash your hands.
That could be one of two things.
Yeah.
Yeah, right before, hopefully, within 5 to 10 seconds of the end, wash them really well. Yeah.
But you don't want to go in front of Jesus with dirty hands. You could make a very capricious decision.
Oh, yeah. Oh, my.
Yeah. My Catholic school, they warned us about making sure there was nothing embarrassing in our wallets when we died.
Really?
Yeah.
I've never been told that, and I went to Catholic school.
So it's like,
I never thought, wow, I should check my wallet now.
Oh, you mean for cosmological reasons or because?
No, St. Peter could find it.
Yeah, among other things, or heaven forbid your mother found something.
Yeah, I'm just checking now. I think I'm okay. Yeah. Wow. I'm glad you brought that up.
Didn't my father say
Welcome.
something like that in the Navy? Like you're told, when you're in a bar, don't drink too much.
Mm-hmm.
If you drink too much, don't tell anybody your name. If you drink so much that you fall on the floor, put your hands over your insignia so nobody can see who you are.
That whiskey.
I had an interesting thought during when you were talking about Sisyphus, you know, pushing the boulder up that steep mountain every day in hell and having it fall back down. I'd never thought about this before, but how is that different than the drudgery of day in and day out life? You know what I mean? Especially like in this time where we're so limited with what we can do.
Well, that's exactly what Camus was saying. I mean, that it is identical. That he's the hero for our times because we all live these miserable, useless lives. But he's saying you have to look at Sisyphus is the solution because Sisyphus understands his life is pointless and meaningless and absurd, and death is waiting him, but he still fights against it. And in the moments between his trip up the mountain with the stone, when he's walking back down, he knows what waits for him, but he knows he's done his job. He can sort of say, "Fuck you, God," and that's the best you can do. To sort of do your job as well as you can, accept its absurdity,
Right.
and keep going. I don't know
But
if
so he's
that's
not in hell? He's not already in hell?
No.
Oh, why did I think he was in hell? That was his. Like,
Sisyphus. Oh, Sisyphus is in hell, but he's not in hell. He's in Hades, which is different. But he's there. I mean, he's there because in life he challenged the gods and resisted death over and over and over again, and he made fools of them until they finally locked him up. And so his punishment was pushing this rock up the mountain over and over again. But
Is it the same rock?
Same damn rock, although
Because it would wear
the
down.
basis, the rock is like a nice little rock like this, and then it gets bigger and bigger until you get to the big rock now.
I thought he was just a process person.
Well, there's a whole, I mean, suicide, the essay by Camus, you could read, Louisa, and it's about the choice of life and death, and he uses Sisyphus as his solution.
that was horrible. The cockroaches crawling up you.
Yeah, was that real? Were they real?
Yeah, it was real. It was no damn.
They were crickets.
Drug induced. Yeah, they were probably crickets.
Right.
And you thought they were cockroaches.
I thought they were cockroaches. In the middle of the night, it's hard to tell.
And very high, right?
Right. It was the methadone.
Next time they give you the methadone, say you can leave off the cockroaches because we've got crickets.
Right, right. I should say that. I should say, yeah, the methadone's working really well, except for the cockroaches.
Yeah.
The
Well,
bad.
they cut down your dose, though. They might cut down your dose.
I'm coming.
Their solution always seems to be to increase the dose.
Mm.
They really like to slam in the cockroaches. I mean,
I have to push my boulder over to the dinner table. So good night, everybody. Thank you so much.
Good
for
night. Good to see
everything.
you.
Thanks for the music. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
I'll play myself out.
it's a good time to stop it.
Bye.
Wow.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Tim.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye. Bye.
Bye, Caroline.